So there is this exhortation that's become ubiquitous at conferences and business meetings like this. Think outside the box. I've really come to dislike this because it's kind of become the new box inside of which everybody thinks. You know? It pays lip service to the notion of transformation without people really understanding just how radical a shift in paradigm actually is. And you can't possibly think outside of the box unless you know what the box is inside of which you're actually thinking. So I wanted to spend our time here today meditating on the nature of the box inside of which we are constrained to create social change. So my career in this arena began when I was a freshman at Harvard. There's a joke about people who went to Harvard. How do you know if someone went to Harvard? They usually tell you within the first 60 seconds of meeting them. And so I chaired the Harvard Hunger Action Committee. I was 19 years old at the time. And for the first time, I was learning about the massive mortality associated with hunger and hunger-related disease. And as I was learning about just how massive this problem was, I became very frustrated with the puny nature of these little fundraisers we were doing up against the massive scale of this social problem. And I wanted to do something big, but I didn't have any big ideas. And then the summer before my senior year, I heard about these two guys who were bicycling across America to raise money for cancer research. And it totally took my breath away. I realized that I hadn't been thinking big enough, that I had been thinking inside the little box myself. And I said, that's what I want to do. I want to do a cross-country bike ride with a whole bunch of students for the cause of world hunger. And so that next fall, my co-chair and I went back to school, and for 13 nights we sat methodically at each of the 13 dining halls at Harvard, and we asked every single student who walked by, hey, will you bicycle across America with us next summer to fight world hunger? And everybody said no. Was the gist of it, except for 38 people. So that next summer, 39 of us flew to Seattle, and we spent the next 9.5 weeks bicycling 4,256 miles across the continental United States. And we raised about 80 grand for Oxfam, which was wonderful. But the more important thing was when we arrived into Cambridge at the end of this journey, we felt depleted, spent, totally exhausted, like we had given the most we could possibly give for a cause that we cared about deeply, and more than that we could not have done. And that was a feeling that I had been very hungry for, that at least one point in my life, doing something that exhausted the full measure of my potential. And so, a few years later, I moved to Los Angeles, and it was the early 90s. It was the height of the AIDS epidemic. It was before protease inhibitors had been developed. And, as many of you probably recall, it was an absolutely horrible time, and a friend would tell you he was HIV positive, and, 6 weeks later, he'd be dead. And there was nothing big you could do about it. You could go buy a ticket to a gala AIDS charity dinner. That was not what you wanted to do. You didn't want to sit and eat Caesar salad, while you were burying your friends. And so I recalled the power of that cross-country bike ride and realized that the AIDS community really needs something like that. It needs some powerful vehicle for the expression of all this anger and all of this grief and all of this compassion. And so we created this event. It was a 7-day bike ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles called California AIDS Ride. And you had to go the whole 7 days. You had to go the whole 600 miles. You had to sleep in a tent overnight. and you had to raise a minimum of $2,000 for the privilege. And that was different because up until then, these thon events had welcomed people with open arms, no matter how much or how little they had raised, which was wonderfully democratic, but it wasn't a very powerful revenue model. And we didn't market the event to athletes or to cyclists. We marketed it to average people who had it in them to do something extraordinary. So when I tell you we had the most motley crew of people pedaling their bikes from San Francisco to Los Angeles, you know, the widest rear ends, dressed in outfits that did not look like Lance Armstrong, you know. But that's what made it so beautiful, you know, to see some 68-year-old woman who lost her son to AIDS, terrified of riding a bike from San Francisco to Los Angeles, but there was absolutely nothing that was going to stop her. And so that first event was very successful. We had 478 people ride. We netted $1,013,000, which was a lot more than we thought we were going to net. And so we began expanding the AIDS rides all over the United States, and we did them from, we did them across Alaska, across Montana, from Boston to New York, the Twin Cities to Chicago, Austin to Dallas, Washington to Philadelphia. And in the midst of that, looked at the issue of breast cancer, which had very similar dynamics, where people were losing their dearest loved ones, their mothers, their wives, their daughters, and there was nothing big you could do but, you know, buy a pink ribbon mug or buy, you know, Kellogg's pink cereal in October. And so we asked, why are walkathons always 10 kilometers long? Is that a rule? That you can't have a walkathon unless it's 10 kilometers long. And there's another box, right? So let's break out of that thinking. And we created this 60-mile long walk, 3 days from Santa Barbara to Malibu. And you had to go the whole 3 days. You had to go the whole 60 miles. You had to raise, I think it was $1,500 in order to do it. And that event was a great success. It netted $4 million. And so we began expanding those all over the United States. And then we began doing events for suicide prevention and other issues. Over the course of 9 years, we had 182,000 people ride or walk in one of these events. They raised a total of $582 million. And in the last year that we produced the events, 2002, the events netted, after all expenses, $81 million, which is the equivalent of about half of the annual giving of the Rockefeller Foundation. We were a for-profit company. We had 400 full-time employees in 16 U.S. offices. We simply charged a fixed, flat production fee for each event that we did. We didn't do any commission-based or any percentage-based fundraising. This was our headquarters in Los Angeles that was made entirely out of shipping containers and raw lumber. The management offices were actually in shipping containers, so if you had an executive that wasn't working out, you just pull a forklift up to the container, and before they knew what had hit them, it was all over. This is a 30-second commercial that we used to show on the events that'll give you an idea of the emotional sensibility of these things.
Dear Mom, having a great time. I was kind of scared, 60 miles in 3 days, sleeping in a tent. But I feel like I'm being carried along on this great big wave of kindness. And they told us this morning, no group this small ever raised this much money to fight breast cancer. 2,000 of us. And we raised $7 million. Wish you were here, Mom. I really wish you were here.